everybody. Can you hear me? If you can hear me, just type a yes or a Y in the chat box. Great. So we're just going to wait a couple minutes, see if anyone else attends today. Feel free to chat amongst yourselves in the meantime as you would in class.
Okay, so where do I type?
So Christina, they could hear. Hi, everybody. Lately, I've been thinking about online learning, and I think we're so lucky to have an online option in our program and a winter series of webinars, because I don't know about you, but I am not loving minus 28 or minus 30. So hopefully you're nice and cozy and warm somewhere inside your home or at a coffee shop. I'm not sure where you're participating from today. Just curious, while we wait for some others, for any of you, is this your first webinar with us? Okay, Edith, your first one. Ralph, too. Okay, great. Welcome. I hope you enjoy it today. Just as you would in class, if you have questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to ask. We don't want this format to feel like it's limiting your questions. Some people find it's actually easier to participate because they just write their questions as they think of them. Feel free to do that in the chat. We might not address your question as soon as you type it, but we will go through the chat to see if there's any questions that we haven't addressed. If we haven't addressed your question in the session, we will try to follow up with you through email as well. Many of the people here today are students of the Canadian Culture and Communication for Nurses program, and we will be also posting follow-up questions and different activities on the discussion board too. So I know that sometimes you start a topic like this, like employment rights, and maybe after you have a question relating to them, or maybe something happens at your workplace and you wonder, what should you do, or how should that case be handled, so we can also carry on the discussion. We see this kind of as a launch to that discussion today. With me here today is Debbie Winterton. You might have not seen this face before, but Debbie Winterton works at the Manitoba Nurses Union as well as myself. And she is the Professional Practice and Education Officer, and is also a registered nurse who used to work at Victoria Hospital for
Over 30 years.
Over 30 years. So you have a very experienced person that will be facilitating the workshop here today. Okay. For the sake of time and out of respect for your time, we are going to officially get started here today. And as people join in, they can kind of catch up where we left off. Okay. We also wanted to let you know that the session is being recorded today, so might be up on YouTube at a later date as well for you to refer to. Any questions so far before we start? None that I can see. Okay. All right. I see some of you have written your full names in your user, but if you can also write your full name in the chat box, as well as something else about yourself, that would be great. So we want to get a little sense of who you are, as much as we can do through chat.
I think, Manola, I would type in the chat box that this is my first webinar.
This is Debbie's first
Yeah.
webinar too, so you're not alone. Learning together. Okay, thank you, Edith. I see a lot of people are typing, so I'm just... Hi, Ivan. I've met you before in person, I believe. Emergency. I'm glad someone does. I don't think I would do very well in that context. Hi, Remia. I recognize your name from other sessions. Steinbach participant, excellent. Can't hear anything. Okay, so check your speaker settings to make sure that your speaker is on, and also make sure you have a headset. That often makes it easier. So make sure your volume is turned up and your speakers are on. And Debbie might be able to help you troubleshoot that. Okay, great. So I think a lot of our current students, maybe some of our past students today. So if anyone hasn't yet written their full name in the chat box, if you can write your first name and last name, that would be excellent. Thank you. Well, we're excited to see you all here today, and we hope that you will enjoy the workshop. For the workshop objectives today, we want you to do a couple things, or this is what we're hoping you'll get out of the workshop by the end of it. We want you to reflect on your cultural background as it relates to unions. So think of what your perceptions might be of a union, what employee rights were in your country of origin, or where you may have worked before. We know some of you, this is maybe your second or third immigration process. So think of the countries and places you've worked and how they've handled employee rights. 2 participants will become aware of the role of the Manitoba Nurses Union. So we want you to understand what MNU, the Manitoba Nurses Union, does. 3 participants will begin to understand what a collective agreement is, and will be able to identify some rights they have under the collective agreement. So we won't be going through the entire agreement. It's lengthy. That process takes a lot of time, but we'll be highlighting some of those rights with you today. Participants will understand how to get help when they experience difficulties in their workplace. So we want to make it really clear to you, so you know exactly, okay, I've started working now as a nurse, I have questions or I have concerns, or maybe I want to get involved. Where do I go to if I want to do those things? So hopefully at the end, that'll be very, very clear to you where you go for help. That's important. And I'm going to hand it over to Debbie now.
Okay, thank you, Manola. And I'm glad to be with you all today through the camera. So first, I want to talk a bit about the regulatory bodies. We often refer to these bodies as the colleges. So they're the regulatory bodies in Manitoba here for nurses. We have 3 of them in Manitoba. There's the College of Licensed Practical Nurses in Manitoba, the College of Registered Nurses in Manitoba, and the College of Registered Psychiatric Nurses of Manitoba. So depending on your designation, you would be registered with the appropriate college. What the colleges do is very different from what the union does. The colleges make the decisions about training, about education programs, and ultimately about your registration as a nurse when you begin working in your nursing career. They set the standards not only for nurses, but also for the education programs. So for example, a registered nurse program, the Bachelor of Nursing program at the University of Manitoba, their program has to meet the standards of the College of Registered Nurses of Manitoba in order for that program to proceed. So all of the educational programs would need to do that. The licensed practical nurses, their programs have to be approved by the CLPNM. They also, as it says there, they also make the decisions about your registration when a nurse begins working in Manitoba. So that could be as a new grad, someone who has just graduated from a nursing school in Manitoba. It could be a nurse who has moved to Manitoba from another province. Or in the case of you, it could be a nurse that's coming from another country and wants to obtain registration in Manitoba. The colleges are the ones that determine what the rules will be about getting your registration and what the processes will be, and the fees and all of those kinds of matters. Another thing the colleges do is they determine the nursing standards, as I mentioned. So for practicing nurses, they need to meet those standards and be very aware of those standards throughout their career. There is also something called the Code of Ethics, and they're all about the same things. They're about how you conduct yourself, your relationships with your patients, what happens if there's some special issues, and how as a nurse you should handle those special issues. They also speak about things like privacy. The Code of Ethics is determined by the particular regulatory body that you're part of. The last thing that the college does there is investigate complaints about nursing practice. So these could be complaints from members of the public. It could also sometimes be complaints from an employer or from a manager. And because the job of the colleges is to protect the public, they do have to investigate any complaints that they get, because their responsibility is to ensure that anybody that practices as a nurse in Manitoba is qualified to be a nurse and is practicing nursing in the way that a nurse should. Any questions about that piece? Okay, I'll let Manola monitor that.
Okay.
And we'll go on to the next slide. So now I want to talk about the Manitoba Nurses Union, which really is what we want to talk to you about today mostly. And you'll notice on our Manitoba Nurses Union, in some of our materials, we have the wording underneath. It says a commitment to caring. And that is what we're about. Our mission statement is to care for nurses, is to care for patients. So it's quite different mandate that we have from the colleges. We're about advocating for nurses and about ensuring that nurses are working in safe situations and that their rights are being upheld. And because we do that, that also is a way of caring for patients. And it's ensuring that the places where we work are providing the best possible care that they can to the patients, and that they're good places to work. So that's what we try to do as the union. The The Nurses Union is run by nurses, for nurses, and we're very large. We have over 12,000 members in Manitoba, and our members are made up of LPNs, registered nurses, RPNs, nursing practitioners, and we also have a few operating room technicians, which is just something that was from previous times. So, but mostly we're all nurses. Not all nurses that work in Manitoba are members of the Manitoba Nurses Union, but most of the nurses in Manitoba are. Whether you're a member of the Nurses Union or not is determined by where you work, and also what kind of job you have in the facility where you work. So for example, we have a hospital in Winnipeg here that's called Deer Lodge Hospital. That particular hospital, the nurses that work there are not members of the Manitoba Nurses Union. They actually belong to a different union. That is unusual because all of our other hospitals in Winnipeg, it is Manitoba Nurses Union nurses that work there. So it all depends where you work. Another thing I want to say about the Nurses Union is we're very respected and seen to be professional, even though we're a union. And we have a lot of credibility, which means that what we say matters, and that government and the public have a high regard for the Manitoba Nurses Union. So this is very important because it means that you can be a professional nurse and also be a union member. And they're not things that are opposite of each other. They're both supportive of each other. And much of the work that we do as the Manitoba Nurses Union is also helping the profession of nursing by helping nurses. So we can go on to the next slide. This chart is showing you what our organization, the Manitoba Nurses Union, what our organization looks like. So very important, you can see that the MNU membership is at the top of the diagram, and that it's around everything else. And as I mentioned, we have over 12,000 members. So the members are the ones that are in charge. It is their union. There is the local worksite presidents. Now these people are elected from MNU members. So they will be the presidents of a particular facility, or it could be of a particular group of nurses. Next is the board of directors of the Manitoba Nurses Union. Again, these are MNU members and they are elected to their positions. The board of directors makes some of the decisions between the meetings of the Nurses Union. And they represent the members in the different areas across Manitoba. Next we have the MNU president and the executive committee. Our MNU president is Sandy Mowat, and she too is an MNU member and was elected to her position. There are also members of an executive committee that are elected. And then of course we have our staff. Nola's one and I'm one, and we have over 30 people in our office that are staff. Ones that you would most likely come in contact with, of course, are Manola as the diversity coordinator. Mm-hmm. And when you start working, you may have contact with a labor relations officer. They help the nurses in the facilities with the union issues. Okay, I think we can go on to the next slide.
Okay, so we want you to reflect a little bit about unionism. So you might have come into this webinar with certain perceptions of unionism. So first of all, are unions common in your country of origin? If you want to type your response in the chat box, that would be great. Are they common? particularly we're talking about healthcare professionals and nurses. So type in the chat, are unions common in your country of origin? No, usually, I'm gonna go back. There's sort of an underground group. Interesting, Melissa. Melissa, where are you from? Nurses Association, okay. Philippines, okay. All right, anyone else? Labor Union, okay. So here, the Manitoba Nurses Union is seen as a labor union. Labor is work, right? So we're a union that represents nurses working. But I know in some countries it's not very common. In the hospital where I work, union is present. People perceived it as a move against the management. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. So if you guys want to move on to question 2, how are unions perceived? Some have already done that. So someone said it was perceived as a move against management. Mataya, if I say your name correctly, I'm sorry. We perceive union in a different context. Can you explain what you mean by that? And Melissa, before I want to go back to what you said as well, you said it was seen as an underground movement. Why underground? You can write a little bit. Why is it underground? Okay. Okay. So, Miriam, in Iran, you have a working agreement each year, and it's updated. Is that agreement with you and management, or is it with you, management, and the nurses union, or a union that is involved in creating that agreement? So while we wait for the chat to kind of catch up here, part of the reason why I'm asking these questions is because we've heard it before, right? So we have heard that sometimes people, particularly internationally educated nurses, are sometimes fearful to get involved in the union because how it was perceived in their country of origin, right? Sometimes we have had students that have actually said, you know, I didn't want to come to the union office because I was afraid I would get in trouble with the law. And we want to make sure that you know that is definitely not the case in Canada, right? If you get involved with the union, the police don't care. And it's actually often seen as a positive thing, right? So Often people that get involved, they care about their workplace. They want to create positive change, and it's not if you're contacting a union representative. It's your right. It's not something that, why are you doing that? It's your right, and people do it all the time when they have questions. So I think it's more commonplace here, and it is something that, in Manitoba, 12,000 nurses are unionized with us. If they're not unionized with us, generally they have a different union. Sometimes MGEU might be the union that they're involved with, but I don't know if there are any non-unionized nurses that they don't have.
Very few.
Very, very few, right?
Like a nurse working as a manager is not in the union. But yes, they're not, the numbers that are not in the union are much, much smaller. It may only be
I think it's really small.
like a few thousand.
Yeah. And
2,000.
depending on your workplace, you can't opt out really. So there are certain situations, I think if it's against your religion, something like that. But generally, you can't, opt out of it because it's there for you. So employee rights, right? Do employees have rights? Now that's a very vague question. But as we go through this session today, as we're talking about different items, I want you to think about these questions, right, in the back of your head. Or if something sticks out to you when we're saying it, and you're like, that is so different than what would happen where I worked before, please let us know, because it's important to reflect on those things and how culture impacts that, and employment rights as well. Because sometimes people, particularly internationally educated nurses, they might not ask about their rights because they might be afraid, and then therefore, haven't been paid correctly for a year and a half, right? We don't want that to happen to you. So we hope that this is, proactive, and that it will clarify some maybe perceptions that you do have. When working in your country, did you have a contract or work agreement, right? How was that negotiated? So was that something that you individually had to negotiate? Was there a nurses association involved? Working as a volunteer nurse, for example, I know, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the Philippines that's very common because there aren't a lot of nursing jobs, right? So people want to get their hours and they work as a volunteer. Your employers here shouldn't be asking you to volunteer as a nurse. They should be paying you for all those hours. If you're wanting to volunteer, you'd probably do that in a different way, but you wouldn't volunteer as a nurse in your workplace, right? Because we have heard sometimes of people doing that too. And then how were mistakes, discipline, and conflict handled? So we're not going to get too detailed with that, but discipline and conflict and who you contact, we do come into play. So the Manitoba Nurses Union can get involved and can help be a support to you in those situations. But sometimes, if you come from a different work setting in your country of origin, you might not know that you have anyone that can really help you. So if anything, we want you to understand that the Manitoba Nurses Union is here to support you.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about what are the advantages of being in a union. And you may think of some of these yourself. The first one is that it provides support to you so that you are not alone. You're a collection of nurses in the union. You're not just one person negotiating an agreement or fighting for your rights on your own. As Manola was mentioning, the union can provide you with protection from, for example, a manager who is not a good manager, and maybe that manager, for some reason, just doesn't like a particular nurse. They can't treat that nurse differently just because they have a conflict with that nurse or a personality conflict. Everybody has to be treated the same by the manager, and the manager has to follow certain rules. Just like we'll see that we as employees have certain rules and expectations that we are to follow. One of the real benefits of being in a union is the improved communication between the employer and the employee. I was thinking about that when Manola was talking about how in some other countries, how it may not be seen as a good thing to be a union member. Whereas here, we have lots of committees where the union and the employer are working together to try to solve some of the problems that could occur in healthcare or could occur in the facility when we're trying to provide the nursing care. Okay? Should I keep talking?
Sorry, just a sec. Can everyone still hear us? Okay. Good. Yeah.
Okay, our picture is frozen, but I think you can still hear us. So I guess I'll keep talking.
Yeah.
So there's benefits to resolving problems of being in a union. It's more brains, more brains together trying to solve the problems. It's a stronger, louder voice than one individual trying to address problems or situations. And the Nurses Union also offers educational opportunities to our members. A lot of the education that we provide is about things that have to do with being in a union, but we also provide some other education. An example I could give you would be we have a conference that we run in the fall every year, and one of those courses is called The Unionized Nurse and the Law. And it's a very good course that helps advise nurses on what are some of the ways to be careful of their charting, be careful of some of the ways of how they conduct themselves and communicate so that they're not getting into difficulty. And I think there should be one more bullet coming, Manola, on this slide. There we go. And one of the main things, and you've probably heard of this, the union negotiates the collective agreement for its members, and it's an agreement between the employees and the employer, so whoever it is that those nurses are working for. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more, the collective agreement, which is also easily referred to as the contract. You may hear other nurses, other union members call it the contract. And it's a booklet. It's basically a book of promises. As I said, it's an agreement between the two parties. And ultimately, whether you're the manager of a particular facility or hospital, or whether you're the nurse working there, we're all there for the patients and or the residents, and to provide the best possible care. So the Book of Promises helps out with us with that, because it determines what are those rules about how we're going to deal with when there might be some disagreements about some issues, how the nurse is going to be paid, how the management is going to provide enough nurses and enough nursing care. It is also an agreement that helps to maintain the relationships between the employer and between the nurses. And we'll see that It outlines some of the rules about how the nurses and the workplace get together and form committees and work on some of the issues. So basically, to say it in a really easy way, the contract says it's got the rules about the fact that the nurse promises to come to work and do the best he or she can and be respectful when going about their work, and the employer promises to pay the nurse wages and other benefits. And very important, the employer promises to treat all nurses fairly and equally. So they can't pay one nurse more than another nurse for doing the same job. Everybody gets treated equal. And there should be another point coming up. The current contract that nurses that belong to the Manitoba Nurses Union has, the current contract will be in effect until March 31st, 2017. So now we're going to talk about some of the items that are in the contract.
Oh, just a second. Sorry, we see there's a question here from Mary Shane. How
Okay.
long will it take for each negotiation or issue to be resolved regarding increase in salary and other incentives? Great question.
Yes, that is a very good question. It's quite a lengthy process. The fact that 2017, like our contract is going to be ending in 2017 at the end of March, already this fall, in 2016, they will be starting to prepare for negotiations. And there's a lot involved in it. There's a committee that's made up of representatives from the union members from areas across the province. And they work together with a staff person in the office, the director of negotiations, and then the employer will have representatives on their side. And it takes quite a few months. Each side comes forward with, we call it their wish list. They come forward with their wish list, and somewhere the two parties end up agreeing on the items they can agree upon. What an important thing that I would say would be the current contract that we have, we always want to maintain what we currently have, and we're trying to make things better. So we do not want to agree to things that would be a step backward. So that process, that negotiation process, takes a long time, and sometimes it will go beyond the expiry date of the contract. But if that happens, the contract still applies until there's a new one.
Thought it would be done by WRHA.
Okay.
So it's done with the employers, correct? Well, we prepare, but then when they're in negotiations, it's with employers, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
There could be WRHA involvement. Some negotiations are done for parts of the province as one big group, so representing a lot of different facilities. And then there's some others that are done just separately between the Manitoba Nurses Union representing those nurses at that one place, and then the manager representatives. It's a bit complicated. So you are, partially right. There is some parts of it that would involve WRHA.
Thank you.
But that was a good question. Okay, wages is, probably something everybody is always interested in when they're starting to work. And because we have a union, it allows us to have competitive wages. And actually, in Manitoba, nurses that aren't part of our union, they usually copy our wages because they want nurses to work for them, so they don't want to be offering a lot less. And our wages are competitive, not only in Manitoba, but also with the other provinces, because we don't want to be losing nurses to the provinces that are next to us. So being in a union allows us to have more power and to ensure that the wages are good wages. And speaking of our contract that we have currently, over that 4-year period of that contract, we got 10.1% increase in the wages. And the last increase of that is going to happen on April 1st. So if you were to look up online right now, and we have on our web, like, don't do it right now, but it is something that you can do where you can look up what the wages are. After April 1st, they're going to go up another 2% from what is posted on our website. And just to give you an idea of what the wages are, a general duty RN starts working at $37.01 an hour would be the starting wage, and it could go up to $44.51 is like top of the wage scale for a general duty RN. So that's not including where the RN might be doing other kinds of jobs that are a higher level than a general duty. Those would be more. So that means almost $70,000 to almost $84,000 a year for an RN. For an LPN, they start at $28.33 an hour, and the top of the scale, as we call it, so the highest level would be $35.32. And their wages on a yearly basis can be from $53,400 to $66,000. Well, 66,000, almost $600. So that would be the difference in wages. Some other things that are part of wages where there would be extras would be academic allowance. That's for nurses that have more than their basic nursing education. So, for example, a nurse, I'll use the example of an RN that has a master's of nursing, or whether they have a bachelor of nursing, sometimes called Bachelor of Science of Nursing. So there is extra money per hour that a nurse with that kind of education would get. And just to say, approximately, it's approximately 60 cents an hour. Masters of Nursing would be more. Some other things that are included, as being a benefit of the wages are that the employer pays disability and rehab premiums on your behalf. So this means you have some coverage if you get injured and are unable to work. And if you were a nurse working in northern Manitoba, your wages will be 5% higher. Oh, someone here is saying LPNs in Manitoba are highest paid in Canada. Good to know. So a very important point that I want you to make note of is that it's really important when you start working that you check that you're getting paid correctly, and that if you're not, that you ask questions about that, and then seek out your MNU representative or your union rep to get help with that, because we want you to be paid correctly for what you should be getting. And it's good to deal with that at the beginning when you first start working, so it can be corrected. If it's discovered later, depending on how much later it is discovered, you may not necessarily get all of that pay from before. So it's really important. And also a very important point I want to make is that if you have experience, you should not be starting at the beginning of the scale. You should always be getting credit not only for the education that you have, but also for the experience that you have. You want to say something?
Sorry, as long as it's valid within a certain time frame. So you'll just need to check with your employers and your union rep with what time frame they go off of. I believe you need to have current hours in the last 4 years. So sometimes IENs, even though they have experience, because the gap may have been longer than 4 or 5 years, you might not get paid for that previous experience because of the gap. So.
I just looked at the time, and so I'm going to talk a little faster. And we will certainly, if we don't have time to address your questions today, we will definitely get back to you with answers to your questions. So some of the other contract highlights other than wages are the contract says what are the hours of work for the nurses that work there. So are they 8-hour shifts? Are they 12-hour shifts? Is your schedule a combination of 8 hours and 12 hours? And you do get a schedule. There is a written schedule, and the schedule is posted ahead of time. Usually the schedules go for a period of 4 weeks or 6 weeks. So nurses know what they're going to be working ahead of time and can, plan their life around that. One of the other things that's in the contract is that you get paid extra for working evening shift or night shift. And just to give you an example, and again, some of these rates are going up April 1st, but right now on evening shift you get an extra $1 an hour more. And on night shift it's $2.05 an hour more. Also there's an extra weekend premium. And that's $1.65 an hour more if your shift is on the weekend. Overtime. Overtime can be quite a topic that people have lots of questions about. So just to understand what overtime is, it's time beyond your scheduled shift. So if your shift is 8 hours and there is a emergency with a patient and you end up working another hour, that would be overtime. Another example of overtime is if a full-time nurse works more than full-time hours in a 2-week period, then that is overtime. We may not have time to talk about it today, but one of the issues that can come up sometimes is mandatory overtime, and that's when you are asked to stay by the manager because they're short of a replacement nurse, or there is patients that need more care. But it's a big topic, so we won't have time to talk about that today. Vacation. You are entitled to a certain amount of vacation, and the contract speaks about that. There's lots of rules about vacation. It can be quite complicated. Seniority is another issue in the contract, and this is basically how long you have been working at that particular place. So seniority is important when you're applying for things like vacation. Nurses that are more senior will have first chance to book their vacation. Another item about the contract is the health and safety. The employer where you work, your employer has the responsibility to ensure that your workplace is safe. So these are just some of the issues that are in the contract and some of the rules that are in the contract. So you would talk with your MNU representative or your union rep if you have questions about some of these items when you begin working. And there's nothing wrong with having questions about that. It's not easy to understand all of the items that are in the contract. Next. There are some other benefits that you get in the contract, and also because you're a union member with the Manitoba Nurses Union. So some of those other benefits are maternity and paternity leave, and also employee assistance plan. The employee assistance plan is not really spoken about in the contract. This is something that every Manitoba Nurses Union member has. It's through Blue Cross, and it's assistance to you to help you with life issues. It could be counseling services, it could be financial planning, it could be because somebody in your family has an addiction. So it is a support program offered through Blue Cross at no cost to you. There are other benefits that you may get because of being an MNU member. Some of these benefits are a little bit different depending upon where you work. You can see them on your screen. So I am not going to go into each one of them. And we will go to the next slide. Okay, this is very important. All our facilities in Manitoba have zero tolerance of staff abuse. So all employees have the right to work in a respectful workplace. There's lots of rules and laws about respectful workplace. And also the Manitoba Nurses Union has worked with government and with other parties like WRHA to ensure that everyone has a respectful workplace. So this includes, when we talk about staff abuse, it includes many things, and some examples of that would be harassment, bullying, discrimination, violence, and some of these situations that are not right could occur because of other staff. They could also occur because of the public that we serve. Sometimes there could be a patient or resident or a visitor who is not treating a staff member respectfully, and there could even be a concern about violence. So these things are not allowed to continue. We have, as I said, we have rules and we have ways that they are supposed to be dealt with. So if you have a complaint, it is very important. And when I say complaint, it means if you have a situation where one of these is happening or a combination of these is happening, it's very important to contact your MNU representative or your union representative. The employer or the facility where you work will have a specific process to follow where you can file a complaint. And your complaint must be taken seriously. So that is where everybody's treated the same, and it must be followed up on.
Sorry, I just want to note quickly that with the complaint process too, so it may or may not be the same as your previous workplace, and whether that's in Canada or in a different country. So just make sure to try to pay attention to that. Some employers are really good at communicating those things, and others may not be as clear. So you can ask for what that complaint process is. It's better to be, again, proactive about that rather than be in the situation and not know how to handle it. Right? But basically, if you're ever in doubt, contact MNU.
And as you can see there on the screen, MNU provides some other services. you're well aware of the Canadian Culture and Communication for Nurses program. MNU has scholarships for our members. We have continuing education scholarship. As I said, we provide some education programs for our members. We have some legal assistance, expense support for nurses that may be having difficulties. It could be with their college. I mentioned about disability and rehabilitation coverage, and there's ways to help people get back to work after they're injured. And I think we, as you can see from our website and some of our other communications, we're very involved in communication not only about our members, but about nursing in general and about the public image of the nurse. This is really important. These next couple of slides speak about when you're starting to work as a nurse in Manitoba. It's very important that you understand as much as you can. So at the time of orientation, if something is unclear, that's the best time to ask for clarification, and it's all right to ask for clarification. So for example, if you find that it's difficult when you're beginning to work and you're not feeling confident or you don't feel ready yet, it's okay to ask for more buddy shifts and to ask for more orientation. You can ask for more training. You would talk to your buddy nurse. You usually have a person that you're buddied with at the beginning. So you can ask that person, or you can ask the nurse educator at your facility or the manager. Again, it's okay to ask for this. A union rep may be able to assist you in getting more orientation. We want to do what we can to help you to be as prepared as you can be. It's important that you have your education documents with you, that you are able to provide them to employers. This relates back to when we were talking about you getting paid properly and appropriately for your level of education. Keep copies of everything that you have submitted to NNAS.
Mm-hmm. So remember that NNAS is something for the licensing bodies. So the employers, currently the process is they don't see any of that, right? So they might ask and you might wonder, why don't you know? It's because that information is not shared with employers currently. So make sure you keep copies.
At the time of when you're first hired, you will likely be told about the benefits that your employer offers. That can be very confusing, so it's important to ask if you don't understand about the benefits. And you can also get help from the MNU office. There is a person specifically in our office that deals with that. It's important at the time of starting to work that you know who your union rep is, who is your MNU representative, and how do you go about contacting them.
Okay. Nurses Recruitment and Retention Fund. I'm not going to speak to this, but later on you can refer to this. There is money available to you, depending on where you work. If you work in personal care after you become licensed, there's funding available. And also, if you work as a permanent full-time, or it's a full-time term position, when you start working as a nurse, you're eligible for recruitment funding up to $5,000. So it's significant. It's something that you want to be aware of. And if you wait and do not apply for this on time, you won't be eligible anymore. So I know there's a lot of things to remember, but you might remember $5,000. So go to this later on.
We can go to the next one, and I'm not sure what to do at this point. This may be different than what you may have been used to in your country, but it's very important that if a mistake happens, that you be honest about what happened. You will not automatically be fired, and you should not be afraid to tell the right person about a mistake that you have made. There will be, I think if you click Manola, there's more on the screen. There's policies and paperwork and who to tell. Your manager will be notified. But it will be worse for you if you do not be honest about what has occurred. What do we do now? We keep going?
A little bit.
Some of the ways that MNU can help you, if you know if you're involved in something that has to do with a mistake, we can meet with your manager. Some of our staff from the office, we can defend you if the employer's decision about your mistake is unreasonable. So it's not the normal expectation, or you're being treated differently, then we can help defend you. If it's a very serious matter, we can provide a lawyer and some resources for you related to that, and a little bit of financial assistance too, through the LEAP program. We can help you and your nurse colleagues improve the situation. Maybe the mistake is related to something that is not good in your workplace. Maybe there is excessive workload. So we can help by meeting, discussing issues. Some of the committees that MNU is involved with could help with this and advocate for change.
I'm just responding to Mary Shane's question. It was a very good question. You asked if there's unexpected scenarios within the area you're working. It ended up that the nurse is guilty. What does MNU usually do? Are they the ones to revoke licenses? So no, MNU doesn't revoke your license. That would be the College of Licensed Practical Nurses or the College of Registered Nurses. And generally, that's not an immediate thing. At times maybe, but generally no. And MNU would be the one to help you keep it. So they don't want to see that happen. That's like absolutely last resort. And often when things like that are threatened, that's when sometimes lawyers get involved and grievances. And so depending on what the situation is, things might move to a more serious level where MNU is involved. But you know, if you feel like you're being investigated and you're going to be disciplined, especially in meetings like that, it would be really wise to have MNU come and sit with you in those meetings with your manager, okay? Because they want to make sure that the employers are following protocol and that they're following the collective agreement, right? So that your rights are protected. Thanks for that question. All right.
So these, as it says, these are some important things to remember. And if you're called to a meeting, like with your manager, and you don't know what the meeting's about, you can ask what the meeting is about. You have the right to ask. If you're unsure about what's going to happen at that meeting, if it's not really clear, and if you're concerned that it could be about discipline or about a mistake, that your manager, you think your manager is mad at you, then you should contact a union rep if you're unsure what is going to happen at the meeting. These are, as we have mentioned, these are some resources to you to find help. The MNU Provincial Office, they will ask you, when you call to the MNU office, they will ask you where you work. And then they put you in touch with the right labor relations officer for that facility or that area. There is lots of information on our MNU website. And even not being a member, you can access that information on our website. When nurses become members, there is even more information they can access. But there is also the public part you can access. And stay connected.
Okay. Well, thank you guys. Thank you guys for all your thoughtful questions in the chat. It's much appreciated. It adds a lot to the webinar. And we know that this is, again, just the start of a discussion. It's a very big topic, unionism and employee rights, and the respectful workplace piece of this, that alone is a workshop unto itself, as well as some of the other things we covered very quickly here today. So we're going to carry on this discussion, as I said, on the discussion board. Those of you that might not currently be students with the Canadian Culture and Communication for Nurses program might not have a clue what I'm talking about. So for those of you that are students, it will be posted on the discussion board. I'm going to have some follow-up questions and scenarios for you to think about. What would you do in this situation, right? Because it's good to put knowledge into practice. And those of you that are not currently our students, feel free to contact us through email as well, and you have our website and contact information. You're asking about the Nurses Recruitment and Retention Fund. We don't really have time to talk a lot about that today, but the link is included here, and Bay, thank you for posting again. So it's good to read up on that. It's called Relocation Assistance, is the $5,000 grant. And it is a grant, but there are time constraints related to that grant. So if you wait until a year after you have started working as a nurse in Manitoba, you won't be eligible anymore for that grant. Most of the employers are pretty good to communicate that with their employees. Sometimes there's a lot of information though, so they might not. So it's something that you can apply for once you have your nursing license and if you meet the criteria outlined in their website. Okay, so just something to be aware of for the future. Before we go, any other questions or comments? Okay. It doesn't look like it. Again, thanks for joining us here today. The next webinar is on Friday, January 22nd. I believe it's at 1 p.m. as well. And that workshop will focus on the standardized patient. So we're going to be doing more role play. So there will be